Hey guys, how you doing today? Today I want to talk about the looting that's happening in Minneapolis. The big news is that they are looting a Target, or have looted rather a Target. This coming in the wake of the execution of George Floyd, the public execution of George Floyd. Um, and the absolute protesting that's going on. I've seen pictures, not from the mainstream media, of course. The mainstream media is worthless, but I've seen pictures of that people are putting up of people standing outside the houses of the murderer who murdered George Floyd, the police officer. Uh, People preventing anyone from leaving his home premises, um, which I think should continue. Um, it really should continue until he's forced to come out and face justice. And if the and here's the reality of how our system actually functions is that if the institutions are not willing to dispense justice, or if the institutions are not willing to do the thing that they are there to do, then they are worthless. And unfortunately, people will begin taking matters into their own hands, which is what we're seeing in Minneapolis, where obviously many of the citizens have decided that there is no rule of law. Um, in America, you're living in a period where you have mass unemployment. The government has done absolutely nothing to ameliorate this. And in the midst of that mass unemployment, billionaires are spiking in their profits because they're looting the treasury. That's what happened. The Congress passed a bunch of bills to give a whole bunch of money to a handful of billionaires, and the billionaires took that money and sat on it. So it was a looting of the treasury, without a doubt. And everyone is losing their mind because a bunch of people walked into an establishment that is explicitly and only there to provide goods to the community. But because many people don't have the access to the resource in order to get those goods, the institution has ceased to function. It exists only as a profit generator, right? And if you can't be part of the system, well, too bad. You get thrown out onto the street, you starve. And I think many people have looked at that arrangement and said, that's unacceptable. I'm going to walk into this gigantic warehouse filled with goods, and I'm going to get the food, the items required to live a reasonable life. And I think they're right to have done so. Because there is no rule of law any longer, the economic system, I even cringe to call it an economic system. It is a religious ideology. Neoliberalism is a religious ideology. It doesn't function as an economic system. Like, once you realize that it has no basis in economics, that it's not a scientific pursuit, it's not a pursuit that exists within the realm of the sciences. Like, imagine if someone said that we can tell what a person will do in their life based on the measurement of their cranium. This is an actual science that existed in the world at one point. That we would measure people's craniums, and from that we could distinguish some sort of personality, and perhaps predict what kind of person they are. This, of course, is not a thing. Completely debunked and defrauded, thrown out into the dustbin of history. But imagine if the leader of the country was like, this is how we're going to determine who goes to jail or not, right? Or some other kind of absurdity. This is who we decide will get food or shelter based on this. right? We would call them a religious nut. We would say that they have a religious ideology. And such is the case with neoliberalism. It has no basis in any kind of economic reality. It's a completely fraudulent system. And so now we're witnessing the consequences of that. We're witnessing the consequences of throwing all our chips into a defunct religious system, a religious ideology that doesn't actually work and isn't actually interested in working for the citizenry, right? The entire thing is structured to give as much power and wealth to a small cabal of death cultists as it possibly can. And so the result of this now is that the institutions of the death cult, right, Target, are now being required to produce the goods that they are there to distribute. The government has made it very clear that it's not going to actually help people do that. The corporations have made it very clear that they're not going to help people do that. And the police have proven that they are a pack of murderers. And so I think people have looked at it and gone, well, then the entire system is over. The entire system is done. We're not interested in participating by the rules that the police won't even abide by. Right? Don't steal. Are you kidding? You murdered a man in the streets. Don't, like, what are you even talking about? There is no rule of law. There is at this stage only what you can and cannot get away with. And people believe that they could get away with looting the Target. And I hope that they're correct. Because the police services absolutely, if they wish to begin to be taken seriously, at this stage, given what I've seen from the Minneapolis police, let's pretend like it's isolated to Minneapolis, but I think for the community to actually come back from this at this point, for this to not be absolutely seen as a pitched civil war at this stage, where the police are an active military force within the state, within Minneapolis. This is how America will begin to function. The police will become a military force. They've already armed themselves as a military. They're already training as a military. And the line will simply be drawn between those who can sell themselves into wage slavery for the benefit of the billionaire class, the death cult, and the large mass of people who will be excluded from that, who will be told, and this is exactly what they are being told. If you are within the clutches of the death cult, right, there are laws that you must abide by, or else you will be expelled from the death cult. You will be abandoned, killed, obviously, imprisoned, which has been happening en masse for years and years, or just simply discarded into the wilderness. And so lots of people now have been discarded into the wilderness, and they realize that the laws do not exist. That it is just, as far as America is concerned, a bloody struggle for survival. And if those are the rules, and if that's how it's going to be, then I think lots of people are organizing under that principle. And if you have two forces that are organizing against one another, that's a civil war. America is definitely plunging itself into another civil war. It's absolutely going to get crazy. Because right now, like the whole country is awash in guns. So you don't even need to be that organized to be a threatening force. And lots... it's very easy for me to believe that as America begins its descent, and as it continues, as the government continues to ignore its citizenry, as the police force continues to militarize itself, it's going to become extremely undeniable to see that America is a failed state. And it's not going to recover from this. It's simply going to begin treating itself the way it's been treating the rest of the world. And we here in Canada can avoid a similar fate. We can avoid it completely. This is the thing, is that we need to look at America and say, how do we avoid becoming that? Because we can easily become that. The path is very simple. Abandon citizenry. Don't allow them access to food and shelter. Continue to ignore the needs of the populace. And you'll get exactly what you have in America, without a doubt. Here in Toronto, I just saw, the police services are the most funded group in the province, right? If you're a police officer, your policing receives more funding than anything else. And this sort of absurdity, right, is like, and then to add absurdity to that, the Ford administration gives them a pay raise. He comes into power and he gives them a pay raise and cuts funding for everyone else, including long-term home care, by the way, just to touch back on the absurdity of that nonsense. So the looting of Target, these sorts of things are going to continue as the populace is continuously abandoned, because this is exactly what happens when you abandon a populace. If the government cared to stop it, they could. It'd be very simple. Provide the resources required so people have access to the goods they need to survive. That's how you would prevent it. Or you can spend far more money, far more time, lose people's lives, lose an entire generation if you want, to this absolutely brutal struggle between police forces and the citizenry, which is what it's going to turn into. And the unfortunate reality is how this is going to look is that giant corporations like Target, as they get looted, as they get hit more often, as these things start to spread, they will begin to pull out of these places. And these places, their entire previous economic model has been completely destroyed by these gigantic warehouses that have come in. And so they're going to be abandoned. They're going to be left to their own devices, because these corporations are going to say, well, it's no longer profitable to be there. And so because they have no loyalty and they're treacherous fiends, right? Instead of their entire existence being, we will distribute goods, it is instead, we will profit off of the leverage we have over other people. And so when they abandon these places, all that's going to be left for the people living there are each other. And they're going to have to try to survive and rebuild their economies without support. And here's where things get really crazy. They're going to have to do it without federal support. And if that's the case, many of these people will believe themselves abandoned from the federal government. They will begin passing legislation. People will take over state houses. Votes will be held. New constitutions will be redrawn. And states will begin acting independently. And what you're really talking about then is the fall of an empire. That the Roman Empire began to lose influence because people understood that, like, their federal government didn't do anything for them. And once that's the case, once it becomes obvious that the federal government doesn't actually exist for the benefit of the populace, because it's done absolutely nothing to ameliorate their suffering, then people will begin acting independently, and more independence movements will spring up, and the American empire can either choose to begin ameliorating the suffering of people, right? Let's pretend the next election comes by and Joe Biden gets in, and let's pretend he actually begins ameliorating the suffering of other people. He probably won't, but let's imagine that he does. Then this could prevent this descent into the breaking up of America, and which could happen here in Canada. We've had separatist movements before. We have separatist movements spring up all over the place. And if the federal government does not continue to act in a way to ameliorate the suffering of its people, then what we're seeing in the States can easily happen here. And you're never going to see any of this on corporate television. I think that's the big thing. The number one reason why I record these videos is because you're never going to see a conversation like this on corporate television. The looters in Minneapolis will be demonized. They will be framed as the villains when these people are just struggling for survival in a system that's steadily abandoning them. If you want the looting to stop, then you should provide the resource required that is withheld from them, unless they sell themselves into wage slavery. It's a truly evil time, and my hope is that we are able to rally, to reunify, to realize what has to be done in order to maintain the union, to maintain the peace. It doesn't look like it's going to go that way for America. Jury's out for here in Canada. We'll see. And yeah, justice for George Floyd. Until the Minneapolis police literally incarcerate the men involved, and probably the full resignation of the chief of police, I don't think the people of Minneapolis will ever trust the police services again. I know I wouldn't. Yeah. Good luck, Godspeed.